We want to welcome everybody to our Exponential 180 webinar. My name is Dave Ferguson, and I get to provide leadership for Exponential. I have with me Jeff Vanderstelt, and I'll introduce him a little later. But one of the things we've been doing, and that's why you're here, is really we've been having some really, I think, critical conversations around how do we actually live out disciple-making principles, which are mission critical for a multiplication movement. And that's the thing that I think many of us gather, especially in the exponential community, that we're passionate about seeing that kind of a movement in the United States. Today, we're actually going to focus on one of 5 shifts. This is the second one in our series, and it's a shift from informing to equipping. And we'll give a little context to that in a little bit. This comes from the book that Jeff wrote, which is the Big Idea theme book for 2024 called 180, The Return to Disciple Making. We specifically asked Jeff. I kind of told him, I said, I felt like it was like a draft, and I got to have the number 1 pick. I said, if I could have one person who'd write this book on disciple making, Jeff was the guy. And partly because I think Jeff is one of the premier thought leaders on this topic that we have in the United States, but also he is a practitioner, and he's done this in a number of contexts, and everywhere he's been, there's disciples that have been made who made other disciples. And so this is not something that comes despite all the vast array of books behind him, not just from a library somewhere, but actually working in a real church, in a real setting with real people. So I love that about him, that he's both a thought leader and a practitioner. One of the things I would love for you to do as you join us here, feel free to engage with us during this time. It's a live conversation. Use the Q&A button. I've got a number of things I want to talk to Jeff about that I think you're going to want to hear, but I also don't want to underestimate, maybe there's specific questions you want to ask him for us to talk about, and we definitely want to make a priority for that. So don't hesitate to use the Q&A button, and we'll take some of those questions as we go, and maybe we'll have a little bit of time at the end. Jeff, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you, man.
To get us started, let's do this, because this book, and I think it's a terrific resource. So if you haven't got it yet, go to exponential.org/180, actually spelled out the word 180, exponential.org/180 spelled out, and you can get this book for free. It's just one of the things that we do at Exponential. It's a great resource for you and your team. But in the book, you do talk about these 5 shifts that you think, you know what, here's we head into 2024, post-pandemic era, churches are kind of really saying, man, and you and I hear this a lot from church leaders, we just didn't do as good a job as we should have in making disciples. And kind of almost in a lament and a repentance kind of posture, you write this as like, okay, here's why churches have struggled, and here's how you can make disciples that multiply. And you give these 5 shifts, which are very succinct and I think really hit them. So let's just hit those 5 quickly. Maybe give me 30 seconds on each. And this time we're going to really land in shift number 2. But it starts out in the book, shift number 1, from reaching to making. What is that talking about? From reaching to making.
Yeah, I mean, I think the shift there is that if we've been focusing primarily on growing the size of our church, and that's the goal, and like if we get more and we get bigger than we think we're doing it, then we're actually not being faithful to what Jesus commanded, which is go and make disciples, teach them to obey everything I've commanded you, which is also including making disciples. So the end should be we have disciples who make disciples. So we got to make a shift from reaching to actually making disciples. And I think that's a big shift. It's one thing to get people to show up. It's another thing to get them to go out and become a disciple making disciples themselves. The second shift, which we're going to talk about more today, is we have to make this shift from informing to equipping. And I'll spend a lot more time on it, but the simple explanation to start with is that a lot of what we do is we talk to people, we give them content, we give them information, we have them read books, and all of those things are not bad in and of themselves, but they're certainly not sufficient. And if all we ever do is give people more and more information, it's very likely that they know more ideas and thoughts, but they don't necessarily know God or one another or their neighbor. and they may not know how to actually go and do the very thing that we're talking about. So we have to do more than just inform them. We actually have to give them actual equipping that enables them to go and be obedient to all Jesus commands. So that's the second. The third shift is we want to move from attending to attaching. And we can get lots of programs, we can get lots of events, we can get lots of spaces for disciple making, and even get people to show up and be present. And we might even shift a lot of things that we do in those spaces more intentionally. But if we don't actually help them truly attach to God, Jesus says this is eternal life, that they would know you. And that word know doesn't mean knowledge about, but intimate acquaintance with, that they would know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom he sent. So if the goal is eternal life, that includes that requires attachment. It requires what Jesus then prays later in John 17, Father, as I am in you and you are in me, may they be in us, so that the world might know you've sent me. And so we have to have this ability to truly attach to God, to attach to others, and then to attach to those who don't really know Christ yet, so they can experience the love of God in relationships. That's a major shift. If we only get people to attend, we're not going to experience that. The fourth shift is from striving to thriving. In my own narrative, as well as I think many people's narratives, I've often led people to go and do the work of Jesus without Jesus. Or another way to say it is to actually expect the outcome that Jesus brings about without the power of Jesus at work in and through us. So we've got to make a shift from striving to thriving, helping people walk in the power of the Spirit, so that the work that they're doing is the very work that Jesus is doing in them and through them by his Spirit. And then second, we've got to pay attention to our emotional health in that same kind of shift, that if we aren't healthy leaders, we're going to reproduce unhealthy leaders. And so in that particular chapter especially, and I think as we come together in Orlando, we've got to address how are we actually doing as leaders, because everything's going to come out of us. The culture you create starts with a character that's inside of you. So if we aren't healthy, if we aren't thriving, then the places that we lead and form are going to also be unhealthy and lack the real power and health of Jesus. And then lastly, we want to make a shift from accumulating to deploying, so that we're not just getting people to come, but we're actually equipping them to go. And that has a real multiplication mindset in it, that we want to see multiplication at every level in the church. We want to see multiplication from every leader in the church. We want to see this become not just a moment, but a movement. And I think a lot of the stuff we do, it's like we're creating moments for people, and those aren't bad in and of themselves, but we way more than a moment. We need a movement of God. And so what does it look like to change the scorecard, so we're actually measuring very different things? And what does it look like for it to start with us saying, I want to surrender, I want to repent, I want our church to surrender, we want to repent of anything that's keeping this from being a movement of God in our own context.
Seriously, I mean, Jeff, just hearing you hit those again, I mean, this is such great stuff. And I love how, I mean, it's like concise. It's kind of like here, from here to here, from here to here. And I'll tell you, all of you church leaders, and because I mean, I lead a local church. This is a resource that, we will use this at Community Christian Church. And I would encourage you, like I already did, go ahead and access this book. I mean, after all, I mean, by Jeff's collaboration with us and part of who Exponential is, we're making this book available for free. So download this book and use it, not just to read it, but also use it with your teams, have discussions around it. Jeff, I think next week you're going into Right Now Media. Tell everybody what you're going to be doing with that, because that's another resource that's coming.
Yeah, we're going to record video for each one of the shifts that will accompany the book, so that way you can use this in your own context. And the way the book is designed is not only do you learn and think about each shift, but then in each shift, there's a workbook in it that you can begin to take your team through to assess where you're at, what you need to do, and start to build plans for each one of the shifts. So we built it so that it'd be designed to serve you, to guide you, to help you even rethink and potentially rebuild some of the things that are going on in your church. And the videos will also support that as well.
And here's the other thing that's awesome about this. And this is thanks to Right Now Media too. They're going to make that available for free. So this book and all those videos will be available to you. Our 2023 theme was Lost Cause. We just finished up doing it at Community Christian Church. It was a great tool for us to use to really reemphasize the priority of evangelism. And this is a great tool that'll be available to you all throughout 2024 for you to use in your churches, have it as a teaching series, use it with your staff, all of your people, like, oh, how do we actually make this turn and go back to what we were intended to do, which is disciple making. So, all right, I'll get off my high horse because I think this is a great thing. So Jeff, let's talk about this a little bit, because you wrote this with this kind of moment in time in mind, and why this we're going to hone in on that second shift from informing to equipping. Why is it in 2023, 2024 that churches, particularly Western churches, again maybe here in the United States, we've got to make this shift? Why is that so important today?
Well, I do think, you started our time talking about what we just went through with the pandemic. And I mentioned this briefly in the intro of the book, that I think for many of us, the pandemic was a bit of a pulling back of the curtain to see what was behind the curtain. Or another way to think about it is we went to the divine physician's doctor office for our exam, and we found ourselves lacking or sick in certain areas. I think what happened for a lot of people was they said, man, if we can't gather on Sunday, then what in the world are we going to do? And it was almost like people are freaking out, because they're like, how, it's almost like we said, if you can imagine your family, like, I've got grown kids, but we can't have dinner together. So what are we going to do? It's like, they're okay. They're grown. They can live their life. And I think for many of us in the church, we're like, we don't know what they're going to do without us as leaders, feeding them every Sunday and making sure they get together. And not that it's not important to gather regularly, but I think it revealed that we didn't actually believe these people could sustain a gospel movement without us making it happen for them. And so I think we saw in many cases a lot of infancy in the church, that we didn't really raise up these spiritual children to be spiritual adults who could spiritually lead in their home or their neighborhood without us. So, and I think the reason why is because this second shift is really important. We've just been informing them. It's kind of like if you sat around your dinner table with your kids their whole life and all you did was tell them what they should do, but you never showed them how to do it. You never trained them how to do it. You never had them try doing it. You would never know if they knew anything. You just know that they listened really well for a long time. And I think in a lot of cases, we realize people have been great listeners, but I don't know if they were equipped as well as we thought they were. And in many cases, we got to see how effective we were at actually equipping them for ministry. And that's our job. Our job is not to teach them ideas. Our job is to equip them, to teach them to obey, Jesus said, everything he commanded. So I think we really got to see that. I think we have to make that shift and get away from only telling them things and giving them ideas to actually giving them actual training so they could go do it without us.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you identified there is, okay, here's the problem. And I think most leaders, church leaders who are paying attention, I think came to a very similar realization. So let's move to the solution side of it. And you're saying, hey, one of the solutions is making this shift from not just informing, not just talking about, but actually equipping. So when that happens, as we begin to make that shift, how does that kind of affect the overall health and impact of a church community?
Well, I mean, yeah, and I'll use the family example again too, because let's say you had a large family and every single member of that family was playing their role, was fulfilling their job description, was equipped to take a responsibility for an aspect of the family's work. Like say it's a family farm, for instance, like the whole farm gets stronger because everybody's doing the work that they were made to do. And I think when we look at Ephesians 4, it says that the body actually will build itself up in love when each part is working properly. And so when each part is actually working properly, which is the result of being equipped, then the whole church works. It's a beautiful organism that actually can, it says it will be the fullness of Christ. That's what it'll grow up into maturity. It'll look like the fullness of Christ. And that's from Ephesians 4. But if you go back to Ephesians 1, Paul says that the goal of Jesus being head of his church, which is his body, is that through his body, he would fill all in all. And I really believe that what Paul intended the Ephesian church to hear is that all of Ephesus is supposed to be filled with the presence of Jesus on mission every day, everywhere, by and through his body. So if the church is equipping every member, then the place in which your church exists, whichever city or community you're in, will actually get to be filled with the presence of Christ everywhere, every day. And if we're doing that, then I mean, you just think of how little work leaders have to do because the body's doing the work. And I
Yeah,
think maybe that potentially is a threat. Let's just call it out. I think we're going to say what's a potential threat is we're afraid they won't need us anymore. Just like
right.
parents who kids grow up and they leave the home, you're like, now what do we do? It's like, no, but that was the whole goal, is that they wouldn't need you, but you ultimately become interdependent. Everybody needs everybody in that particular picture. So now we're all interdependent on everybody doing their job, and it's never overly dependent on just one or two or three.
So could you say a lot of our churches have 30-year-olds still living in the basement, sleeping on the couch?
I am convinced of it.
Yeah. And that's not what you want as a parent. What you want is you
Not at
want you
all.
want your kids out there making a living, making a difference, thriving, hopefully even having their own kids, for
Yeah,
multiple generations.
that's
All right.
right.
One of the things you do is you give us in the book, in that resource, you give us a couple different tools. And again, this is part of why I love, what you do, because you make it practical, because you are a pastor and you have to make it practical so it actually works in real life. And one of the things is the A.P.E.S.T framework. And you really see the A.P.E.S.T framework as a catalyst in this shift towards kind of equipping believers rather than just informing them. Kind of go ahead and elaborate on why you see that as kind of a catalyst for that.
Yeah, and Dave, I don't even want to act like I came up with that, right? Because that's the
Right.
Apostle Paul saying it. So,
And you know
like,
what? Maybe that's a good point. Because for us, there's a little bit of exponential speak here. When I say A.P.E.S.T, what does that even stand for?
yeah, it's apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. It comes out of Ephesians 4. So apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher comes out of Ephesians 4. And you want to start, if you ever try to teach this, those of you who are listening who like to teach, you need to start at the beginning of chapter 4. Don't start in the middle, because at the beginning it talks about this idea of us being called to this calling. And then he goes on to say that every one of us has been called. And then he says, now you're supposed to live into that calling that you've been given. And that calling looks like Jesus setting a bunch of captives free and then giving these gifts to the world. And these
Yeah.
gifts he's talking about are apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. Now, he says, each one of you. So it's not just some of us. It says he's done it through each one of you. Grace has been given to each one of you according to the measure of Christ's gift. And then he just kind of just this little parentheses, by the way, he's the reason why he ascended and descended is so he could set the captives free and then give them as gifts to the world. So he's kind of just saying, like, in case you missed out on the goal of the gospel wasn't to get you out of this world to heaven someday and out of hell. The goal of the gospel was to get you set free to be a gift to the world, so that through you, Christ might fill every place with his presence. Well, how does he fill his place with his presence in the fullness of who he is? Through those fivefold, because he is the ultimate apostle. He is the prophetic voice of God, who is the word of God. He is the evangelist who not only proclaims good news, but is the good news. He is the shepherd who is the chief shepherd, laying down his life for the sheep. And he is the ultimate rabbi teacher who tells us what truth really is. That's who he is. Now, the whole framework Paul lays out is, if that's who Jesus is, and we want to grow up in the fullness of Jesus in our place, then we got to make sure our church or local expression is equipping the people of God in a way that they begin to grow into all five of those things as well. And I believe, and I think Paul makes it really clear, some of us are uniquely set aside to equip in one or more of those better than some others are. And so if we've got some who are more apostolic, they're there to train up the church to actually be a sent people. And they need to be regularly speaking. They need to be regularly showing. They need to be regularly training and demonstrating what it looks like. Same with the prophetic. They're not, the apostolic is saying, let's keep going out until the whole world is reached. Let's start new things. The prophets are going, but don't forget what he said. Don't forget where we're going. Remember to be that holy people who remembers the voice of God and speaks forth the voice of God into the future. And so we need people training us how to keep listening to God, how to keep being faithful to God, how to actually be a holy presence in a place. We need that evangelistic, gifted person. In the book, I call them gifts. The people are gifts. Not that I have a gift. We are a gift. So we need the gift of an evangelist, or many of them in the church. You can keep saying, here's how you tell the good news in such compelling ways. Here's how you call people back into this group of people that are God's people for the sake of the good of the world. Like, so these are the good news people. These are the recruiters. These are the people keep the message in front of us, keep it compelling, keep showing us how to tell the story in ways that win people over. We need those people equipping, demonstrating, and doing it. And we need shepherds who are continually saying, but are we caring for one another? Are we loving one another? Are we building each other up? And those people tend to be more dominant these days in the church. I think we're lacking some of the first three in terms of really emphasizing their ability to equip. But we can't lose the shepherd equipping either, because we need to care for one another really well. And then lastly, we need the teacher who's going to keep saying, hey, this is in here. Like, we need to know it. We need to know how to live it out. We need someone to help us build systems and tools that really protect how we stay faithful to the word of God. And those people also are given as equippers, so that we're all immersed in the word and knowing how to live it out in everyday life. So in the book, I just talk about those five, how each one of them is meant to be an equipper in the body, how we can both demonstrate to equip, but also declare to equip. And those are, I think, are the ways that we have to think about all five of those, and even ask our church, are we missing any? Are we highlighting one more than another? Do we find ourselves being a little bit distorted because we've only been highlighting one or two of those?
So I'll tell you what, so do that. So with the A.P.E.S.T, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, gifts right there, right out of Ephesians 4, in a very practical way. So like when you've used those in a local church, all right, how have you seen that make a difference? So maybe if you got a story or an example of what that looks like, because for some people, this is, even though it's right there in the Bible, it's still a foreign idea. So what's an example of that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the apostolic as one example. When I go into a church, sometimes if I'm even just helping coach or help lead a church through a transition, I'll ask, like, what are some of your struggles? A lot of them will say, like, well, we're not really growing, we're not really extending out, we're not seeing new people come to faith. We have certain people groups we don't have any idea how to reach. And the first thing I'll ask is, do you have anybody in your church that has ever started something new? You got any entrepreneurs in your church? You got any business leaders in your church? Do you have any people who came back maybe from cross-cultural missions? Maybe they're retired, or maybe they're taking a furlough or whatever. Have you let them speak into the church at all first? Like, do they have a voice? Do they get to say what they see? Do they get to critique and also potentially give ideas and new thoughts towards something? And if not, let's start there, because I bet you they have a lot of things they could share with you. But then second, like, have you let them actually get into groups and help groups think about, how would we start a new thing? How would we enter into a new territory? How would we launch something that's never existed? Because a lot of groups are stuck because they have no apostolic influence. And so they don't know how to start new things. They don't know how to enter into new territory. They don't know how to break new ground. So a lot of times that's with the apostolic, it's just bringing them into your presence and letting them ask questions, letting them give you some thoughts, maybe even saying, would you stay with us long enough? I did this with a group when I stepped into transition to church. One of the groups was really unhealthy. I said, how about if I join your group for 12 weeks and I'll help build a foundation for new apostolic work. And then I coached them for a year. And by the end of the year, they were reaching people they'd never reached before. And that was just because I'm an apostolic leader.
I was like, was that because you have an apostolic gift and you joined that and you were able to stimulate that, or is that because you identified someone else?
No, in that case, I did it. And I think partly because the church that I stepped into, I think driven most of the apostolic leaders away.
Right.
And so we needed to kind of create a culture where that was welcomed again, where that was exciting again. And so we had to kind of rebuild that.
And what I love about it here, you're saying too, is that when you begin to really recognize what is in Scripture, and also is in our churches, you not only identify it, but then that person who has that gift, it actually gives them permission, okay, that apostolic person, that entrepreneur, to do the stuff that they probably do at work, that they probably do at home, they probably do with their friends just naturally, instead of just being a passive attender. And that is part and parcel to what you're talking about, the shift from informing to equipping.
Yeah. All right. And by the way, that's why I use that example, Dave, because I wanted to stay away from giving an example of a shepherd or teacher, because we tend to think of those as like, oh, those are the staff people of a church too often. And so I wanted to do, now, by the way, all five of those I think are in your church, and they aren't always on staff. I mean, they probably are on staff as well, but just so you know, one of the things I say in the book, and I hope that we make a big deal of over and over again this next year, is these are all God's people. And if they've been set free to be given for the sake of this work, please don't put them back into captivity.
Right.
Please don't like shackle them back up. And I'm dealing with a group. I won't say who they are because it's who knows who's watching. Dealing with a group right now where they're like, our pastors don't actually think that we count.
Wow.
And so I'm trying to help the pastors realize the gifts you have are in the body, and they're doctors and they're lawyers and they're teachers and they're stay-at-home parents. And like, that is your staff, but you don't know how to free them up. So they're all captive every Sunday, just watching you do everything.
Yeah. And for a lot of us, I mean, and I got some site pastors, it's kind of well-intentioned, but it's still, but that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
All right. Let me too. I mean, we got a great group here that's with us, and we're live. If you do have any Q&As, any questions, use the Q&A button. If you want to ask Jeff any questions, we'd be glad to kind of banter some of those around. Okay, so you gave us that first with that A.P.E.S.T tool, very helpful, right out of Ephesians 4. But then there's a second tool that you also give us, which is the acronym D.E.E.P.E.R, which again, I love this because it's sticky. It's something you want, okay, got it. I can actually use this. It's really important to the equipping process. Explain how you have used this in a number of places where you've been, and even in your training with churches now, this acronym D.E.E.P.E.R to help people as a framework for how to make disciples that make disciples.
Yeah. And this is some of my own conviction, and, coming to a place where I had to confess, man, I think I've been primarily informing people too. So I just want to make sure I say that. Like, it's like, okay, I want to grow in this. And so I think I intuitively began to do it, and then we gave language to it. So this is the language. We just use the word D.E.E.P.E.R as an acronym. First of all, D, you've got to demonstrate it. So as I go, I'll kind of give an example. So one of the things that we train people in the context I've been is how to tell their story, making Jesus the hero. And so that's something we think everyone should know how to do. And so we want to demonstrate that. So whenever I train people how to do that, I tell them, hey, in just a bit, I'm going to do it in front of you. Okay. Now, here's another thing I've learned. When you tell people they have to do it, and then they have to also teach someone else what they learned to do, they all engage the training very differently than if they think all that's going to happen is you're going to talk for an hour and then you're going to dismiss them. Yeah. So when you tell them you're going to have to go do what I'm going to have you, what I'm at training, that's really important. So first of all, we demonstrate it, we explain it. So we want to say, this is what it is. This is how we do it. This isn't always in this order. Sometimes we explain it, then we demonstrate it, but these are the categories nonetheless. So we explain
and reminded everybody, you're working through an acronym. The D is demonstrate, the E is explain. This is why it's sticky. Your people will remember this and they'll actually do it.
Yeah. So demonstrate, explain it. Then the second E is that we want them to experience it. So whatever it is, we want it to happen to them. In the case of me telling my story, I want them to hear me share my story, so they experience me sharing it to them. Then we're going to have them practice the very thing we just demonstrated, explained, and they experienced. They now practice it. And what we want, and so in the case of the story, we said, hey, I'm going to do it in front of you. Here's how we do it. You're going to experience me do it with you. By the way, who wants to go first in practicing it? Because you're going to practice this. And so in our case, we would put them into triads, and we'd say, hey, we're going to have each one of you share your story, making Jesus the hero. So you're going to all do it with each other. So they all had to do it. We would then walk around and listen and see how they were doing, which is the next one, which is expose. We want to have exposure take place. So demonstrate, explain, experience, practice, expose. Jesus did this. Like, he put his disciples in a place where their character would be exposed, where their doubts would be exposed, where their fears would be exposed, where their inabilities would be exposed. So we want exposure, and we want them to be revealed. We want things to show up. And too often we just assume everybody's doing everything we ask them to do, but there's never been anybody watching them. So there's no exposure to see where we need to work on. And it's not, you got to create a place where it's celebrated to fail. Like, you have a celebration of failure because it means we tried. So you've got to have a high grace culture to do this kind of stuff.
Yep.
So there's exposure. And then lastly, then we're going to ask them to reflect on it. What was that like? What would you have done differently? Jesus pulled his disciples away all the time to reflect on their experience. How would you encourage us to even train you better next time? What would be more effective? And then I tell them, there's two more R's really, but repeat that process,
Yep.
the deeper process, until they can reproduce it in the life of another. Once they can reproduce it, you've equipped them. If they can't reproduce it, you haven't trained them. So that's the whole idea. So we use that D.E.E.P.E.R acronym. So in the case of the story, I told my story in front of them after I explained how to do it. They experienced it. They knew they were going to practice it, but I even got exposed. We let them ask questions about my story publicly. Most of them said, man, I've never been in a church where the lead teaching pastor was this honest and real about his own story, which that itself is so powerful,
Yes.
And then we got to reflect on my story, and they got to ask more questions. And so they saw the whole process happen. Then they had to repeat it. Then they had to go do it with someone else.
All right. We got some questions coming in here, but I'll tell you what, Chris has a great question here. And maybe we'll come back to some more on application of that deeper. But Chris has asked this: from conversion to disciple maker, how long do you generally see that process taking?
I think, obviously this is a general statement because every person's different, but I think if you're intentional in the ways that we're describing, I think it's probably 2 to 3 years.
Is it possible? Okay, let's say I'm also curious about this.
Why do I say that?
Yeah,
why do I say that? First of all, because that's how long it took Jesus.
Oh, okay. It's kind of hard to argue.
Okay, like took 3 years, so and he's the best at it, and he also spent day in and day out with these disciples, and almost none of us spend that much time. So I don't know that we should expect it would take a lot less than that. In terms of, and I'll say, and this is another one of the shifts.
Jesus was making disciples, but to really the place where he actually deployed them,
that's right.
It was 3 years.
Yeah, if we're talking about getting to them becoming spiritual parents, let's say it that way.
Yeah, that's probably because from day one, that's what he was doing. And I think you would probably say, oh, as soon as someone becomes a believer, no, let's get after it right now. But it may take 2 or 3 years to become spiritual grandparents.
Yeah, yes. And that's what I was thinking. So let me clarify that. In terms of them becoming a Christian, I think we can begin to have them practice all the things that are in the scriptures as soon as possible. I mean,
right. I love it.
Right. Just like when we're training up a child in the way they should go, pretty early on, we're beginning, once they can start walking and talking, we're getting them to kind of do all the things they're going to do later on, just as an infant child. And then we just expect childlike behaviors because that's where they're at. And I think the same is true with disciples, that we got to expect some childlike behaviors, but we got to lead them in the way they're to go as early as possible.
Here's a question that came in from Paul, and he's asking this. So Jeff, in a typical church, okay, because you've not only you've pastored, but you also do a lot of coaching with churches now too. So there's a breadth of experience here. How long does it actually, he put in all capitals, so I guess he wants specifics. How long does it actually take to make the shift from being informed about discipleship to actually doing it? So I think I'm going to speak for Paul a little bit. I think he's smart in that he's saying, hey, this sounds like a culture shift. And I'm curious, and I'd like to take my church on this journey, because I think I have been probably one of those people, like we've even admitted at times, doing too much informing, and I do more equipping. How long does it take to make kind of that transition, that shift?
Well, if we're talking about a holistic shift where the whole church is beginning to live this out, then I think I'll give these steps. The first year is generally the leaders repenting and figuring out what they need to do in light of their repentance. And it really does take about that long, I've learned, to get everybody on the same page. Year 2 is now getting the church to hear and repent and learn new ways. And it takes them about a year to start to even be open to the change. And then year 3, I find, is when they start to actually say, I'm ready to lean in and practice the change. And so my sense is it's probably 5 years, realistically, for transitioning a church, maybe upwards to 7 years, just realistically. I've seen, if you're a smaller church and you're younger church, I don't mean by like chronological age in terms of the people, but like if the church has been around only a short period of time, that can change a lot quicker than a church that's been around for a long period of time. And then the larger the church, the harder in some ways to transition. So smaller is a lot easier in some cases, but not always. So
and I mean, this has been my experience, to see if you'd verify this. you're really never done transitioning, because I
No,
mean,
that's right.
you're constantly creating culture. And I mean, and if you're wanting to make this shift, I mean, it's not like, oh, okay, hey, we got to 5 years, now we're done, and it's going to be good for the next 20. I mean, you got to come back and teach this deeper acronym every year. You got to find
Yeah.
ways. I mean, right? I mean, so it's the culture creation
Well,
thing is, you might arrive at a certain point going like, hey, I think we're really a disciple making culture. That's awesome. But if you don't stay after it, there'll be, I mean, my experience is there'll be drift. What's your thoughts?
I totally agree. And here's the reality: when you live in a Christian culture, and what I mean by that, a country that has Christians living in it, whenever people move to join your church, it's gonna threaten the culture every single time people join the church, because they're bringing with them another church culture experience. Second, the thing about the D.E.P.E.R is it's not just a overt thing; it's a very covert thing. And what I mean by that is, like, does everybody that has the ability to teach and train in your church have it embedded into their system?
You want them to become unconsciously competent.
That's right. Yeah. So they're not thinking through it. It's already in them. But you want to also be able to go like, wait a minute, let's look at what we just did with our youth ministry this last year. Did we just tell our kids what to think and what to do for a year, or did we actually do deeper training with them for a year? How was the curriculum built? How was the experiences built? Like, I think the tendency for everyone is to shift back away from mobilizing and equipping the priesthood of the saints. I really believe that's the enemy's greatest scheme, is to convince us that there's only a few priests in the building. And so like that, I think that will always be a pull, away from equipping and mobilizing every believer for the work of ministry. So I think it'll always be a threat that we've got to pay attention to.
All right, let's try to hit a couple more of these. Okay, man, a lot of questions. This is good. Les is asking this: what's the difference, or maybe a connection between the gifts in A.P.E.S.T, like we see in Ephesians 4, and the other gifts that we get described in the pastoral epistles, like encouragement, like discernment, those kind of things? How would you? Difference?
The way that I teach about this, and I actually do a little bit of this in the book, though I'd like to write a whole other book about this. I think it merits another book. But I teach the idea that when we look at the Greek language, we see that there are people gifts. That's apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, Ephesians 4. There are skill gifts, which are abilities, spiritual abilities that we've been given, like encouragement, like administration, like leadership. Those are skills that people are given. So think of it as, I am a gift. I have gifts. So I might be an apostle, evangelist, but I also have the gift of teaching and leadership. So I have gifts. Those are skills. And then when we go to 1 Corinthians, we see manifestation gifts, which are, he actually calls them spirituals or spiritual empowering. So what they are is they're a spiritual empowerment for the moment according to the need that is present, which is why I believe at any time, anybody can be given the gift to pray over someone for healing. Or might be given a word of knowledge or prophecy or ability to speak in another language or interpret a language. Like, those are all manifestation gifts that can happen at any moment according to the need of the moment. So I usually teach that we are a gift, we have skill gifts, and we can all walk into the manifestation gifts of the Spirit as needed.
Okay, that's super helpful. Tim's asking this: we've used the fivefold survey, and there's a number of different kind of surveys out there, and you've probably seen them. And for those who aren't maybe familiar with this, you can find it. You just Google it. There's a number of different surveys that can help you kind of take an assessment of like, hey, what is the A.P.E.S.T? But Tim's saying, hey, we've used the fivefold survey in the past, but kind of curious, is there a more organic way of identifying apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher in our churches? And do you have thoughts on surveys or more organic way? Or
my preference is use the survey after an organic approach. So let me explain how we've done this. What we'll do with a group is we'll give them a basic tool. It might be a video they watch or a thing that we've written that just describes all five. And then we'll say, now think about your group, and we might give them a piece of paper that has everyone's name with the descriptions of the five up front, up top, and just say, as you think about Cheryl, which one or more of these comes to your mind when you think about her in light of the description? And so you write, shepherd, teacher, and you got Joe. I think he's more prophet, evangelist, or whatever. And so we tell them, write at least two for each person that you think kind of stand out, but put them in order to the one that came to your mind first when you thought of them.
Hmm.
And so after you do that, which is, by the way, is super, super encouraging because everyone gets to have someone talk about them, right? So you're like, okay, let's talk about Cheryl. What'd you all put for Cheryl? And
Right.
what's this? I've seen this happen consistently. Almost every time, everyone says almost the same thing.
That's cool.
They
And so
usually
that's
can discern.
super affirming for that person.
That's right. But they usually can discern. Cheryl, when we're around you, we feel so loved. And you're always asking if we're caring for people well. And when someone's not here, you're the first person to notice. And, and then on the other hand, you also regularly say, well, what does God's word say about that? So it seems like you probably are a shepherd teacher. And she goes, oh, right, cool. And then let's do the assessment after we've done that exercise and see, does that line up with what the assessment says? And I've learned to trust the group more than the assessment in most cases, because I think sometimes those assessments are still colored by how we perceive ourselves. And I've been with some groups where it's like if you're at a church where the teacher is the most highly valued, everybody wants to be a teacher. And so sometimes people say they're a teacher and they're not. And because you're just not around them, you don't learn a whole lot from them, in terms of like didactically,
Right. And
So,
turns out that, A.P.E.S.T has been around a lot longer than a digital survey.
That's right. Yeah. So I like to use the survey to affirm, but not to be the first step out of the gate.
Let me ask you this question. This comes from Roger, and he's a little bit of a confession, but he's still curious. He says this, still working out my understanding of cessationism, but
Fair.
I scored as an evangelist and a prophet on the A.P.E.S.T. So it sounds like maybe he took a survey. So he's saying I'm an evangelist and prophet, but I'm still trying to understand and work that out. I do have a passion for the bride of Christ. As I understand it, the gift of teaching is prominent in most churches. So how do you see the relationship between these gifts on a team of disciples?
That's a great question. And first of all, let me say this. I do want to clarify the difference between a teacher and the gift of teaching, because I think there's both people who are teachers and there's some who have the gift also. So like I would never score teacher on A.P.E.S.T, but I clearly have a gift of teaching without a doubt. Right. And that shows up. I teach like an apostolic or an evangelistic leader.
Okay. Oh,
right?
good.
That's how that comes through. So I want to say that first. Now, second, I think the reason why the teaching gift, it seems to be highly developed, is because that is the one thing we do really good equipping around. We tend to teach people how to read their Bible. We tend to teach people how to teach a curriculum. Like when you think about what we've emphasized the most, it is that particular gift, is the teaching gift. It's also the one we platform the most. It's the one that we tend to value the most. And so I think that's why it's so prominent. And I think if we did the same thing with all the other gifts, I think we'd see a big shift in our churches. So now, how do they work together as a team? I think there's a sense of mutual appreciation and then I'm going to use the word deference too, when we think about how we work together as a team. And I don't know if I'm answering the question, so correct me if I need to say something different, Dave. But like one thing I've discovered is like when you make a decision, who generally speaks the most? And have you listened to all five voices? When you create an event, who is the one speaking into that the most? And have we given authority to all five voices to shape that? And what I've found is in most cases, we've generally let one or two be dominant voices and everybody feels like they have to shrink back and be quiet. And so creating a culture where we say, hey, have we heard from all five voices? Hey, I don't think we've heard from many of the shepherds yet. Like, as we think about this culture of disciple making, we'd love to just have everyone be quiet a little bit. Shepherds, would you just speak into what you've been hearing? What do you think needs to change? And I think there's something about giving voice to everyone and then saying, okay, then what do we need to do about that? Which is, I think, where we get to the equipping piece. Like, I don't think we've been creating a culture of care in this particular place in our church. Okay, shepherds, you're going to have to help us with that. Yeah. Would you like to let us know how could you train us? How could you assess us? What would it look like for us to grow in this area? And then I would apply the D.E.P.E.R acronym to what they're going to do. So that's just one example. I don't know if I'm answering
that's
well,
really good,
but
because is your experience too? That probably a lot of those with the shepherding gift versus like an evangelist or apostle, are more timid, are more quiet, and so you have to draw those voices out.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
And
How
I
are you
will
doing
say
on
this
time?
too.
Go ahead.
Sometimes we push the prophet voice out because they're sometimes hard to listen to,
As in
right?
annoying?
Yeah, because they're going to say things we don't like.
Right, right, right.
so
Just
yeah, we've got
spoken
to
like
also
an
make room
apostle
for
right
them.
there. As in annoying? How you doing on time? You okay on time?
I'm good. Yep.
Okay, I'll tell you, we got one more, and then because we're pushing our time here, but people are really engaging.
Good.
Eric's got a here. This is a very practical question. I think he picked up on your story, and maybe he resonated with us. He said this: are there any practical ways you know of that can help a church be more attractional to apostolically gifted people? If a church doesn't have anyone of that gifting in the body, what are some ways you can attract them to the church? So it sounds like he's in a situation where, hey, yeah, we're like that church you're coaching, and we recognize we don't have, some of those folks that are more entrepreneurial, that are more apostolically gifted, and we would love to have them be a part because we think there's some really important things they could contribute. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of ways to do it. One, you got to create a vacuum for it. What I mean by that is, like, if you say, hey, we've never been a church planting church, but we want to become a church planting church, that's going to create a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now we actually have room for apostolic types to come be a part of. Maybe it's going to be a 1-year residency, and you go, I don't even know how to build it. That's okay. Go contact an organization that knows how to build those things, because there are apostolic organizations around you that you can tap into and say, will you help us build a vacuum? Which we're going to call church planting, because that's what apostolic leaders are generally attracted to. So that'd be one example. Another might be, we're going to go and find in our city those who've already left the church and done apostolic works, because they didn't think there was any place for them in the church, and come around them, learn from them, say, how can we support what you're doing? How can we actually leverage more of our people toward what you're doing? And we'll see that as an extension of what we're about as a church. That's now creating favor towards apostolic expressions. And when your church starts to see that you favor apostolic expressions, you're going to attract a lot more apostolic leaders because they know that you care about it. So that'd be a second way to do it. The third would be to start saying, hey, we want to pray that the Lord would actually raise up or bring to us people who are apostolic. And on the stage, we're going to talk about, or however you gather, we're going to talk about regularly. We really believe we're supposed to break into new things in the city to bring the gospel to places we don't know how to bring it to. So could we as a church begin to pray that God would both open our eyes to see what those places might be, but also attract the people that would come join us in helping to establish those new places? So those are just 3 suggestions.
All right. Terrific stuff.
By the way, also, last one,
Yeah.
when you're making your next hire, be open to a more apostolic leader if you don't have any on your team yet.
Oh, yeah.
So easy.
Super helpful. All right. Hey, Jeff, thank you very, very much. Those of you who tuned in, this was great. And make sure you catch the upcoming webinars because we'll hit the rest of these shifts. We're excited about that. But also, if you're really digging what we're talking about here with, 180, return to disciple making, you can register for our global conference, Exponential 2024 in sunny Orlando, Florida. That is March 4th through 7th. And you can register right there at exponential.org/2024. It is just a great event. We'll have over 5,500 church planting leaders there that are all passionate about disciple making and multiplication. There's a rate deadline today. So if you're going to go, I would, for 2 reasons. One, you can get the best rate right now. But the other thing is it will sell out. It sold out for several years in a row, and we're already on pace to sell out earlier this year than we did last year. And last year was even earlier than the year before. So make sure you do that. In addition to a remarkable kind of main stage speakers, including Jeff, who will be there, we also have 200 other speakers who will be leading 150 workshops. It is a can't miss kind of event. So go check that out, exponential.org/2024. Would love to see you there. Rate deadline is today to get the best rate. All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Hey, Dave, before we go, can I say one last thing?
Absolutely.
Okay. A lot of you are wondering, how do we reach the next generation? Because we're seeing them leaving the church in many cases. And I would say to you, both millennials as well as especially Gen Z, they are a can-do kind of generation. Like, they believe they can do anything, and they may be a little naive in that, but I think they probably can do a lot more than many of us think they can. Here's what will happen if you don't do some of the work we're talking about. They will go find some other place that will pour into them and develop them to help them live out their dream. And if I were in your shoes as leader, and this is where I'm going as well, it's like, I think we need to be a lot more like Home Depot. Like, you can do it, we can help with this next generation, that we believe you can do it. We believe you can make a massive difference. We believe you can change the world with God's help and his work through you, but we're here to help you. So how do we serve you? How do we equip you? How do we help you figure out who you are, develop you into that, and mobilize you outward? We're not calling you to join our thing or build our thing. We're going to join your thing and help you build the thing that God's called you uniquely to bring into this world. And I think if we make that shift, which that maybe is another shift that needs to be in there, but that's really that deploying one at the last one, we can make that shift. I think this generation is going to say, man, thank you so much. I need help. I just didn't know if anybody cared enough to help me.
And back to what you said, when you use that Ephesians 4 framework of A.P.E.S.T and that great tool of D.E.E.P.E.R, I mean, it clearly sends that message to that younger generation.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Love you guys. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.